I'm very informal on all of this stuff. I don't get too anxious about it anymore. We're 2 years into this. Those first few months, oh my God.
Of course.
Serious panic going. There was serious tech panic going on in the background, but now it's just like, oh.
It'll work out,
It'll all work out. We're all here to talk about a great book, have some fun.
Exactly.
I just for everybody's while we're giving Facebook some time, was in the green room with Kristin and Julia, and it was like a minute before we were supposed to go live, and I was like, oh, you guys know the routine, right?
Got it.
Yeah. Speaking of technical difficulties, I think every time I've interviewed you on a Facebook Live, Kristin, it has had a technical issue. So
that is so true. It's so weird that nothing's.
Okay, wait. We need to knock on some wood or something so that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I know, Julia. I was shocked that you even asked me to do this, because usually you and I together online are a disaster. I was like, wow, she's really tempting.
I realized what it is. So it's when I interview you, that's the problem. So I think we're safe this time. But
so when I interview you, that must mean the exact opposite, which is that this book will be like a massive New York Times bestseller. Yeah, everyone's going to buy it from Warwick's today. Yeah.
Is that right? I love that vibe. Speaking of, I will be putting the link for that into the comment section of Facebook. If you're watching this, I'm recording it. We're going to pop it onto YouTube too. If you're watching it on that, we're not live if you're watching us on YouTube, but you can still come to Warwick's and buy the book. I'd like to say independent bookstores do ship books. So you can get your book from an independent bookstore.
Exactly.
Which is awesome. And for those that, Kristin, we've hosted you. I think we hosted you back in September.
Okay. Yep.
For the Vanishing. So. Yeah. And I was cracking up because I think I remember like one of the things that everybody was like obsessed about was where to get the coat that's on the cover of your book. Everybody was obsessed with the red coat. It's like, where do I buy that? It's like, really? And then Julia, it was like a year ago with The Last Garden, right?
I was thinking about that the other day. I think it was almost exactly a year ago, maybe give or take a week or so. But it's come up quickly.
Yeah, welcome back, both of you.
Thank you.
Love having both of you. So have to do my due diligence. I'm going to do my intros of both of you, then I'll go away. Kristin and Julia are going to chat for about 35-ish minutes. I'm going to put the book in the comment section that you click. Also, we love audience questions, so please go ahead and put those into the comment section, and I'll bring those into the conversation later on. So, Julia Kelly is the award-winning author of books about ordinary women and their extraordinary stories. In addition to writing, she's been an Emmy-nominated producer, journalist, marketing professional, and for one summer, a tea waitress. Julia called Los Angeles, Iowa, and New York City home before settling in London. She's with us today to talk about her new book, The Last Dance of the Debutante. Yay, there it is.
There you go.
Such a pretty cover. God, I love that cover.
Beautiful. I love it.
Yeah. Joining her is Kristin Harmel. Kristin is a New York Times bestselling author of a dozen novels, including The Book of Lost Names, The Winemaker's Wife, The Room on Rue. I never say that right. Will you say it for me? I
never do either. The Room on Rue Amelie. It took
there
me
you
a
go.
long
Thank
time
you.
too.
Anytime I try to pronounce anything foreign, I just sound ridiculous. So the sweetness of forgetting. And what was the last book? Was the
Forest of Vanishing Stars. Yeah. With the beautiful red coat, right?
With the beautiful red coat that everybody was obsessed about. She's also the co-founder and co-host of the popular web series Friends in Fiction, and she lives in Orlando, Florida. So with that, ladies, have a great conversation. See you in about a half hour or so.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us. And thanks everyone for being here. Julia, I'm so excited to be here today to celebrate the launch of your brand new book, and I can't wait to talk about it.
Oh, thank you so much. You are always so incredibly generous in agreeing to do things like this, and part of it is just I enjoy getting to chat with you. So I guess everybody else gets to watch us chat. So.
I do too. We'll talk about this later, but of course, here's your book. I was just looking around my office, like, where did I put it? It's literally right in front of me. Here we go. Sorry. Like a minute too late as usual for me. You did such a beautiful job early on in the pandemic of pivoting to this virtual space and doing something good, something light and bright and wonderful that kind of came out of all this darkness. And so it's been wonderful to kind of be on this journey together with you. Like we've done something similar with Friends in Fiction, and yeah, I think we've both grown as writers and literary citizens in the last almost 2 years.
It's been fun. And it's also, I was going through emails, which I'm woefully behind on because of the holidays. So I was going through emails and I got a couple of emails from people because I did a little bit of a end of year wrap up, here are the things that have happened, because it felt like such a big year, a long year at the same time. And I had a lot of people reach out and talk about how much reader events and things like this, virtual events, through bookstores and through authors' websites, and of course, Friends in Fiction being the big example. And then I have a show, Ask an Author, as well on Facebook, and how much it really meant to them in terms of just connecting with other readers. Because I think sometimes if you don't have a big group of people in your family or your group of friends who are readers, it can feel a little lonely, and you want some people to talk to, about books and just have a chat.
Well, it's funny. I posted about this event on Facebook yesterday or today, and I had a couple people comment and just say, "Oh, like I like you both so much as people. Like, of course I'll be there." And I thought, like, how nice. But that's been one of the benefits to this, is I feel like, because we have these frequent interactions online with with each other, with other authors, with readers, I feel like people have gotten to know us as people, and we've gotten to know other people as people. So it's like our worlds have gotten smaller, but they've gotten so much bigger at the same time.
Absolutely. Well, and it's funny to the point where, like, when I went on Friends in Fiction in December, I was wearing a jumper that I had knit, and I made a big point of pointing out that I had knit this thing. And so now I have people asking me for the jumper pattern, telling me that the knitters also. It's nice. It's a nice way to connect with people and being more than just a name on a book that they read, which is wonderful too. But it's maybe a little bit more personal.
I completely agree. But speaking of a book they read that they'll be completely moved to buy from Warwick's today, because we all know we love to support independent bookstores, and especially these independent bookstores who are continuing to put on wonderful author events like this one. So do consider buying The Last Dance of the Debutante from Warwick's today, if you're thinking about buying it. Julia, can you tell us about your beautiful new book, The Last Dance of the Debutante?
Well, I appreciate the beautiful compliment. This is a fun departure for me. I've written a few books set in World War II, and this is a book set a little bit later in the 20th century. It's 1958 in London, and the Queen has announced that she is no longer going to be receiving debutantes to be presented at court. So they used to have these big presentation parties where all these girls would be brought out into society, and she's not going to do that anymore. So this is the last rush to have your debutantes presented, essentially. And our sort of entry into that is Lily, the main character, who's a young woman at a bit of a crossroads in her life, as many people are when they're that age, trying to figure out what they want their life to look like. So for Lily, there's sort of two competing forces. One is her family, who's much more traditional. It's her grandmother and her mother. Her father has passed away, and both of them really want her to be a debutante. All the women in her family have been debutantes in the past, and so it's important to them, and she's sort of happy to go along with that. But there's this other element, which is sort of the world is changing and society is changing, and things are changing for young women. So if you think about 1958, we're sort of on the cusp of a lot of really big social movements, including the swinging 60s in London and the second wave feminist movement, and a lot of things opening up. And so for Lily, it's a question of, does she do something else with her life, and what would that potentially be? Or does she go down this more traditional path? And while she is a debutante, because being presented is just the beginning, there's a whole season of events, and she, through those events, meets two very different young women. One is Leanna, who represents more of that traditional world, and the other is Catherine, who is sort of a new money millionaire debutante, but she's got some very different ideas of what she wants her life to look like. And that pulls her in two different directions. And then it's not one of my books without a big family secret in the middle of it. So that also is kind of a catalyst for Lily making some really big decisions, because her life is not exactly what she originally was told, or her family is not exactly what she was originally told it would be.
Ooh, I love it. Oh, everyone's going to love this book so much. Okay. So I think that for most of us, this idea of being a debutante presented at royal court is just unimaginably out of reach, because it feels like it belongs to such an upper class lifestyle. I mean, you and I are super fancy, Julia, but like, I
Well,
still,
we still wouldn't have qualified probably. No, it's true. It is a really elite, really privileged group of people who could be presented. And it is also a really interesting group because they're going through a lot of change at this time too.
You've also talked a lot about how even within this elite privileged class, though, there were sort of these cliques and divisions. Did that have to do with like new money versus old money, or families who knew each other? Or can you kind of talk a little bit about that? It's just so interesting to me.
Absolutely. So just within the debutantes alone, the rule was you could only be presented by a woman who herself had been presented at court. So if you think of that, it's mostly within families, grandmothers, aunts, mothers, cousins who are presenting these girls. If you were new money, you could, for a lot of money, hire a chaperone to present your daughter. And that would have been a professional woman who had been a debutante herself. And she goes out and sort of brings out a couple of girls a season, usually women who were a bit hard up for cash, but had all the connections and the breeding. But then there was also the added layer of you needed to be invited to be presented. You couldn't just walk in off the street. So all these women in 1958 apply for invitations for their debutantes. And I believe the number was about 1,400 were accepted for 3 presentation parties in London and then 1 in Scotland at Balmoral. And so it's a really elite group of women, but even within that, you have some women who are much more traditional, longer standing families would have been considered elite. You have some women who are the daughters of peers. You have women who had fathers in the professional sphere. So, bankers and barristers and diplomats. And you get a lot of people with different backgrounds, even within this elite group. And so you do have some social stratification. And it was a question of sort of who the popular debutantes were, who would have been advantageous to be friends with, because a lot of the currency of the season is invitations. So who you knew really mattered, because that meant if you knew a certain number of girls who had sort of the higher profile balls, coming out parties, things like that, you would have potentially been able to meet more of the kind of quote unquote important people as part of the season. So there's a lot of jockeying for position in this world and in this book.
Is this something that still goes on today? I mean, I know, of course, that this was the last time these debutantes were presented to Queen Elizabeth, but is there still a version of this that happens in England? It's reminding me very much of the American South also, as you're talking about it.
Absolutely. Well, and it's funny you mentioned that, because a couple of women on Facebook have cheekily said, oh, there's still debutantes where I'm from. And yes, absolutely. I'm from a place where there are still debutantes presented. Pasadena, California has a junior league that does a companion and does a debutante ball. But this is really focused on the debutantes in England, which is really where that tradition started. So talk about a time of change. 1958 is the end of the debutante presentations. The season does go on for a little while, and that's the collection of social events and social calendar for the elites. But it really starts tapering off towards the end of the 60s and the early 70s, partially because the girls didn't necessarily want to do it anymore. And society was sort of moving on. And so really in its true form, you don't have the season anymore. You don't have debutante presentations. There's been an effort to revive a little bit a sense of the London season, but it's not the way it was. It's certainly not anything close to what these girls would have experienced.
The more I'm hearing you talk about it, the more it's blossoming in my head as like a Netflix series, right? Like a 1958 set Bridgerton or something. I love it. Like this. How do we make this happen, Julia?
Netflix producers, please, Amazon producers, whoever, please call me, because it would be wonderful to see a book like this make it onto the screen, in part because there's so many dresses and locations and great cars and all of that. But, we'll see what happens.
Hey, it's the beginning of a new year. You never know, right? Like all these possibilities are open. All right. How did you come up with the idea for this book? It's so different. It's so unique. I mean, I write in the World War II space, as you have obviously like in the past and may possibly do again. And in that space, I think the challenge is coming up with a story that hasn't been told or hasn't been overtold, but in a setting that is still somewhat familiar. this is just a new world. I mean, this is something we're not that accustomed to reading about. And it's a really just interesting, unique idea for a book. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to this, where the original idea came from, and how you knew it was the story for you?
Sure. Well, the book is dedicated to my mother, and for very good reason. She was the one who presented me with the book that triggered the idea. So my friends and I, were doing a mother-daughter tea because we felt like our mothers would all get along really well.
Oh,
And
nice.
so this was just before the pandemic in February 2020, which seems so far away. But we were at a bookstore beforehand and decided, we were a little early, so we stopped to get a coffee. And my mom and I were sitting and chatting about books, and she said, I read this book and I think it might really make a good novel. And I have the book here. It's called The Last Curtsy by Fiona Mccarthy. And it's a nonfiction book. And it's essentially a history of the 1958 season by Fiona McCarthy, who herself was one of the debutantes in 1958. Sadly, this is not her. This is a great photograph, but it's not her. And she is ended up becoming a writer for The Guardian and a really eminent biographer here in the UK. And she writes very lovingly, very factually, and with a little bit of tongue in cheek about what the season was like. And she knows that it seems very old fashioned to readers now. She knows that it's very much a lost world, but I think she does a wonderful job of capturing that. So this is one of those kind of gold mine moments when you're an author, is you find somebody who's literally written the resource text on what you're writing about. And so I was able to go through, and she gives such loving detail about that book, about that period of time, that outlining the book was really straightforward. And then I got to do some fun additional research, including speaking to some debutantes. So I spoke to one woman who actually was presented in 1958. She didn't do the rest of the season, but then I spoke to two women who were presented who were debutantes in 1964, but weren't themselves presented. So we're sort of putting together the pieces of the puzzle, and they were able to speak to me as well. So it was one of those things where my mother suggested the idea, and it just sort of clicked into place, and I took off running with it.
I love that you got to speak to these women, because I think, again, going back to writing about World War II, that's getting harder and harder to do. There are fewer and fewer people who are around today who were old enough in that time period to have absorbed the details, and who are still around today to talk to us about that. But you've jumped forward in time, and there are still people left, and people who have a very clear recollection of it. Can you talk a little bit about how that shaped the book, and maybe how that differed from writing about a time period in which there were fewer firsthand sources?
I think in some cases I wanted to make sure what I could get right, I really got right. And I feel that real responsibility in World War II as well. The book that I've just handed into my editor as a first draft, it is back in World War II in part. And I think when you're dealing with such a weighty topic, you really do want to get it right. When it comes to the presentations in 1958, I wanted to make sure that I was getting the details right. And I was also being respectful of these women as well, because I think the impression that I got in reading The Last Curtsy, and also in speaking to the women I spoke to, is that not a lot of people have asked them about their debutante experience, because there's a sense that it was frivolous and it was really privileged and really elite, which it was a very privileged position to be in, but it's still their experience. And I wanted to be respectful of the fact that, it wasn't silly to these women. It was very serious to them. And there was a lot of, social currency wrapped up in everything from invitations to, which party you went to and who you danced with and all those things. And in part, I think that is really important, because there was a lot of weight and a lot of pressure put on how well a debutante did. It may not be the sort of Georgian, Victorian, Edwardian eras when you were literally on the marriage mart, you were trying to get engaged in your first season, in your second season, but these were still women who were being introduced to sort of quote unquote eligible young men, and also other women who would have been sort of believed to be appropriate to be friends with. And so there was a lot of social pressure. And I think for a lot of families in particular, it was a huge expense, and you felt the responsibility of doing it well because your parents had put so much money into it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was thinking, as I was thinking earlier about you talking to these women, to these firsthand sources, I was thinking about my experience with writing The Forest of Vanishing Stars, which was my book that came out this past summer. And one of the people I got to talk to, it's a book about people who survive in the forests of Eastern Europe during World War II. And one of the people who I got to talk to was a man who actually had survived in the forests that way. And when I spoke with him, I think I expected to get more tangible detail about what the ins and outs of his life were. And I got some, because there were some very specific questions I couldn't find in any text, and he was able to answer them for me. But I think what I got more was just the emotion that, like, you can't really get from a nonfiction book that's chronicling, the ins and outs and the details and the years and the dates and the happenings. Like, it just being able to say, how did this make you feel? Or how did this change your life? Or what piece of that did you carry forward? It to me, it shaped the characters in the book and the arc of how they grow and develop in a way that I didn't expect. Was that something you found too, was having this opportunity to talk to people and to see it from their point of view and to really understand that they didn't look at it as something frivolous, as you were saying? Like, were some of those things that shaped, were they things that shaped the character arcs and the narrative in a way that the secondhand research material couldn't?
I think it was. So I managed to connect with these people primarily partway through the process of writing the book. So in some cases, I was sort of confirming things that I suspected or had been able to sort of glean from my research. But in some cases, it sort of gave me a sense of how varied the experience could have been for a girl. I think my sister and I were talking about how we would have done in a debutante season. And I think I probably would have done fairly well, but I think I would have eventually ended up being bored and a bit frustrated. My sister, absolutely not. She had no interest in being a debutante. She's much more introverted than I am. And so I think your personality could dramatically affect your season. And one of the women who I spoke to also, and I want to be careful not to give away too much detail about her family, but something happened both at the beginning of the season and in the middle of the season that sort of changed the course of her life. And so the season was a very weighty, very much a milestone for her in her life. Decisions that her parents made and things that happened during that period of time absolutely changed what she was able to do later in her life. And there was a change in family circumstances midway through the season that meant she didn't complete the season. And so her experience of that is very much colored by what happened to her. Whereas a friend of hers who I spoke to, she was fine. She got through it. She had her friends who she had. She, was happy to talk about it. She remembered where she got her dresses from. She just had a very different experience. And so I thought making sure that there was a sense that the debutantes were not a homogenous group. They had a lot of different motivations, a lot of different feelings about things. Even the ones who enjoyed it and wanted to do the season may have been coming to it with different backgrounds and different motivations. So I wanted to make sure that there was a sense that different girls had very different experiences.
That's an interesting thing to talk about too, because I think one of the things that you do so well, not just in this book, but certainly in your previous books as well, is you write female friendship very well. Female friendship, but also the complications that come along with it. It's not just, we're all getting along together, let's go have a sleepover. Female friendships are complicated, right? And one of the complications, it has to do with, where we come from in life and where we're going and what our circumstances are, and kind of when those circumstances push up against each other, especially during a time that you're in a situation that you can't control, whether it be in the middle of a war or in the middle of a debutante season, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about what draws you again and again to writing these stories of powerful female friendship and female friendship that shapes the characters' lives? Because I think you don't find that in all books.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's a big compliment.
You do it really well.
Well, thank you. I've always been attracted to stories about women that are less known, which I know we've talked about a lot on events and also off camera. So that's always been a big overarching thing. But I think out of that also, I still feel like even though we've had sort of a proliferation of shows and books and media that looks at women, I get very I get very uncomfortable with the idea of women are just all catty and competitive, or they're all completely in sync and, it's just they're rock solid friends for their entire life. I think the reality is that women's relationships with other women are infinitely complicated because they can be a whole number of different things. So in this book alone, there's sort of a frenemies situation. There's a bit of a, platonic soulmates who meet. Two of the girls get on just like a house on fire. And then there's everything in between. And I wanted to show that you could have relationships with people that are complex. You could understand people's motivations for doing certain things, but if they hurt you, they still hurt you. And if they're supportive of you, they're still supportive of you. And it's funny, one of the things that this is about my previous book, The Last Garden in England. One of the things that I'm really interested in is that I still get people saying that's a book about female friendship, which I think it very much is. But some of the characters in that book, I don't think you would mark as friends, but there's a bond between them. So again, it's a complicated relationship, but I think there's an element of understanding there. So it's been really interesting and really fun for me to explore different facets of, women's relationships at different times in their life. Also, this is not a YA book, but the characters are 18, 19, 20 years old because that's the age they would have been as debutantes. And I know my relationships with my friends were very different at that age than they are now at my current age. So it's just, there's a lot of growth, I think, within women's relationships throughout their lives. And it's been fun to explore that.
That's interesting. That's a great answer. Okay, switching tracks a little. I know you and I have talked about this many times before, and I think anyone who tunes in to Ask an Author with Julia Kelly knows this about you. Probably most of the people out there watching today know this, but in case they don't, you live in England. And I think that's always something that's really interesting and something I'm quite jealous of, because I tend to write about France, and I think I'd do it a lot better if I were currently living in France. So you're getting to live in the place where you write. Can you tell us, even though I know the story and we've talked about this many times before, can you just tell us, in case there are people out there who don't know, how you came to live in England where you're living now, and how this has kind of fed your writing over the last several years?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I think you write fabulously about France, and
Thank you.
to live in France, all the better. But
thank you.
There's a reason that I have this ridiculous Victorian fireplace behind me in a 1-bedroom flat in London. It's because this is what the houses look like in London. So my accent doesn't match this fireplace. And that is because I'm an expat. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. My father is American and my mother is British. So I was very lucky and qualified for British citizenship. I was a British citizen and now have a British passport. And so I lived for a long time in New York City and loved it. It was hugely formative for me, but eventually I realized my entire family had slowly moved over here to London. And so I decided it was time to make the move as well. And ironically, it was, well, perhaps not ironically at all, it was moving to London that really prompted me moving into historical fiction from historical romance, which is what I wrote earlier, because I was just walking around London and seeing all of these different war memorials and really fascinated by them, because I'd never lived in a city where the memory of the war was so present. And the memory of people who I was speaking to, the war was so present. I know my mother, who grew up in Liverpool in the 50s and the 60s, talks about how it was.
How cool. What a life she got to have. Liverpool in the 50s and 60s?
There are a lot of fun family stories. A lot of women going off to the dance halls and things like that. And it was a great time for music. Of course, the Beatles come out of there. But she mentioned that one of the things that was really prominent in her childhood was people remembered before the war and they remembered after the war. And the war was this marker of, much in the way that the pandemic I suspect is already, but will be for people living through it now. It was an event that just defined everything that happened in your life and was your marker for when everything happened. And so I became interested in that just through osmosis, really. And that worked really nicely with a request from my publisher to write a book about World War II.
Oh, that's neat. I didn't know that's how it started.
Yes, yeah, they strongly suggested it be about World War II, but anything in 20th century Britain. And I said, well, it's funny you mentioned that. I actually have a pitch I've been working on, and it just was absolute serendipity.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, how do you think living in England, in Britain, has fed your research and your writing these last several years? Just, I think there's something to be said for being able to not effortlessly, but perhaps more easily get those small details and small nuances right that an American writing about Britain, from America wouldn't quite hit the nail on the head with it. Have you found that easier as you live there for longer?
I think there are elements that are easier. I think
Okay.
certainly in terms of idea generation, like I said, it's being immersed in the place
Yeah.
that you're writing about really helps. But people also really, really want to tell writers about stories that they think might make a good book, and I'm sure that you have this as well.
Yes.
But everything to the person who comes and does the electrics on the flat when I had an electricity problem, to friends when I'm talking to them in the pub, oh, my grandmother did so and so, in the war. And it's really interesting how
It
many stories
is.
come out of the woodwork. But I think it's also, on to some degree, it's interesting being an American author writing for an American publisher, and then also, the Canadian branch of that publisher, about Britain while living here, because
Yeah.
you do have to make some interesting decisions around language, what things you think will and won't translate, how British you
Mm.
can be in your books. And it's interesting. I have a British partner, and he read The Last Garden in England. He's The Last Dance of the Debutante is on his nightstand right now. But he read The Last Garden in England, and he said, it's really interesting. I can tell that there are a couple little tiny things that I suspect for American readers wouldn't work as well. So, you went ahead and did that, but really you're trying to do as close to, the way that people would speak and the way that people would present
Yeah.
themselves. And I think that is part of that extra flavor, is
Yeah.
until you sort of live in that culture and are immersed in it every
Yes.
single day, it's harder to get that exactly right. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with being an American writer writing about London, or an American writer writing about France.
Yeah.
But maybe just little pieces like that are easier.
I completely agree. I think it makes the whole task a little bit simpler and a little bit more effortless, which is awesome. I mean, I think the real flavor of that comes through in your books just beautifully. Um, Speaking of living in England, can you talk to me, or Britain? Can you talk to me a little bit about the writing process for this book, and how you and the book have been impacted by COVID the last almost two, I can't believe it's been almost 2 years, but the last almost 2 years now, because it sounds like you came up with the idea for this right before the pandemic began. So I imagine you wrote the entire book, during this time period. Can you talk a little bit about that?
No, that's absolutely true. I collected the book from my mother over my father's birthday, which is the end of February. And then everything went into lockdown, of course. And so I was pitching the book. In fact, I remember talking to my agent about the book while walking around on my one sort of legally mandated walk during the first lockdown. And, it was a really, really positive thing to have something constructive for me to do that produced a
Yeah.
book at the end of it, because
Yeah.
I appreciate that it doesn't work for everybody, but I am one of those people who likes to have a project on the go. I like to feel, like my brain's stimulated and activated and all of those things. And
Yeah.
so I think it really helped. And I think it really helped writing about relationships. This book is really a book about friendships and relationships. And I think I could
Yeah.
pour a bit of that in when quite frankly, I was living by myself, in a city where I had good friends. I have wonderful friends, but London is big in the way that, a lot of American cities that are sort of larger scale cities, Los Angeles, Dallas, things like that. There's a lot of urban sprawl. There's a
Yeah.
lot of urban sprawl in London. And so not everybody lives near each other. So even being able to go out and walk with each other wasn't always an option. So I think that really sort of just from a sort of a writing and mental health standpoint, it was helpful. And then, there were certain things that I could do online research wise. And obviously the telephone is a beautiful thing when you're interviewing
Yes.
people, but also I found myself really in the situation where I couldn't go do some of the on the ground research that I would normally do. So I usually try to get access to places like the V&A to look at the dresses, go to the places like the Savoy and, the Dorchester and various other hotels. And that just wasn't an option. So it was a lot of using Google Maps and a lot of using images and trying to source images from the time. And, it was a challenge, but a good challenge. And I'll tell you one thing about working from home is you become very disciplined about writing from home. So even more so than I was before.
That is true. That's a good point. Well, Julia, I have two more questions for you, and then I would love to bring Julie back on in just a couple minutes. So for all of you who are tuning in, if you haven't had a chance to ask a question yet, and you'd like to ask Julia something, now is your chance. We'll have a few minutes for you to do that. So type your questions into the comments. And I do want to give you one more reminder that if you're watching this today, and you're watching Julia talk about The Last Dance of the Debutante, I do hope you'll consider buying it from Warwick's. These independent bookstores that put on events like this, it's a huge time investment on their part. It's a lot of effort. And they're so supportive of us, and they're so supportive of readers like you who are hungry to continue having these events, even when we can't always go out into the world and, tour. And there would be no other way for us to be seeing Julia right now. So if you want to
time zones away.
Exactly. And an ocean away at a time that things are kind of shutting down in a weird way again. So if you're watching this today and you want to thank Warwick's for bringing you this opportunity, buying Julia's book from them today would be a great opportunity. Which brings me to my second to last question, which is, Julia, for those viewers who are going to rush right out and buy the book from Warwick's after listening to you talk about it today, and who plan to devour it immediately, can you tell us one little tidbit or secret about the book that'll mean something to us after we've read it? Is there like a little, so we can be on the inside and we can be like, oh yeah, I know that because the author told me.
Well, I was thinking about this, and there's part of the book that's just off limits because it's just too spoilery. So I'm careful here, but relatively early in the book, I think, at least my experience as an author, and you can tell me if you're the same way, there's always a scene that I enjoy writing the most of every book. Okay. And it's usually something that makes me laugh for personal, completely unrelated to the book reasons. There's a scene very early on where Lily has her first night out with this group of people, and there's a lot of champagne and a lot of dancing. And I enjoyed writing that very much, but I enjoyed writing the aftermath. Even more so. And so the tidbit to know is that my sister did a launch event with me because she's a book blogger in and of her own right. And she mentioned to me beforehand, she said, did you write that scene about me? It's a hangover. And I said, what do you mean, did I write that scene about you? And she said, I just really felt like there was a lot of me in there. And I just thought, oh, that is universal. I think that is an experience that a lot of young women have had after a very good night and a lot of champagne. So it's become a family in-joke that everything in that book is about Justine, and particularly that scene. But no, it was not about her. It's about the universal experience of enjoying yourself a little bit too much, perhaps, and then needing to pull yourself together for a very important event that inevitably follows.
Well, I have to tell you, I'm relieved because I thought it was about me. So now I'm so glad to know. I assume that's also not the case.
No, don't
it's
worry.
like she knows what happens to me after a night of champagne. All right. My last question before we bring Julie back on is, Julia, can you tell us a little bit about Ask an Author with Julia Kelly, which is this wonderful interview series that you do on Facebook?
Of course, it's funny you mentioned that because I need to do a little bit of work to get the machine going again. We've taken a holiday break, but it is an interview series with authors, predominantly historical fiction, because that's the genre that I know and love, and I'm myself working in. And I'm very nosy. I ask authors to come on and talk about their new books and ask them a lot about the writing process and the research process. And sometimes the conversation goes off in really interesting ways. And it's just a fun opportunity to get to sort of lovingly grill some people who I really admire, and then who readers also always come with wonderful questions. And the whole idea of it, of course, is that you get to ask an author whatever it is that you want to ask them. And it's a lovely, little community of people who in some cases don't live in places where a lot of people go on book tours. And so it's really been an opportunity to, for me to get to reach out and meet a lot of people, because I don't always get to go on book tour given that I'm over here, but also for people to get to meet some of the people who they really admire and ask them about their books, and also discover new books that they may not have read.
Well, Julia, it's such a great series. And to anybody out there, if you have not followed Julia yet, and if you have not seen Ask an Author with Julia Kelly, it is certainly worth checking out. You ask authors amazing questions and you get insights out of people that really, I think in a lot of cases, change the way we look at their books. So I do hope people will tune in. And I really hope people will pick up The Last Dance of the Debutante.
You read the right book. I have 2 books right here. So.
All right, Julie, would you like to come back in? Are there any questions for Julia?
Hi,
Okay.
Julie.
Hi, you guys. Oh my God, such a great conversation to go on and on. The comment section is exploding.
I figured it might.
But I have to say, I really want to say a couple things. And your last question about the little insight, there was a comment that somebody loved the secret was so good. It was so shocking in your book, Julia. So everybody has that
wonderful.
to look forward to.
I'm very glad I surprised somebody.
Yeah, it was that. Yeah, the comments are fantastic. So I know you both are busy, but if you have time, there's some fantastic comments that went on in the comment section there. And before I go into some of those questions, though, I do want to thank both the Ask an Author and the Friends in Fiction group that is here and the community that is here. You both have created such a wonderful community. And I want to thank all of the ladies and gentlemen who joined us today from those two places, because they're wonderful. Because I recognize some of the names because I've seen, and it's just like, so thank you, everybody. We at Warwick's truly appreciate you tuning into our event with these 2 wonderful ladies too. So thank you for doing that.
That makes me so happy.
Yeah, lots of the Friends of Fiction thing's fantastic. And I can see that there's lots of people. So
good.
The comments are scrolling. So I'm going to do my best
Okay.
to capture one of those, because it's like, oh my goodness, because you're looking at the tech team here.
You're doing great.
Tech has never looked so
Production,
glamorous,
it's like, oh my goodness. Here we go. But one of them is the question's for both of you. So we'll start with you. Oh boy, let's see, how far did it go here? I know that's the fun. It's for both of you, and kind of what you're it's always one of the things, what are you reading and who's inspiring you right now? So Kristin, you want to take that one?
Sure. Aside from The Last Dance of the Debutante, which I've read and been inspired by, we had last night on Friends in Fiction, we had Sally Hepworth and Kelly Rimmer. So Kelly, I've read for a long time because she writes historical fiction, and I blurbed her last book. I've known her for a long time. Her dear friend is Sally Hepworth, who writes the most delicious domestic suspense.
They're so good.
Oh my gosh, they're so good.
They're so good.
So it's plus she and Kelly together are like the funniest comedy team in the entire world. Like, I think I had tears running down my face for most of the night last night because they were just hilarious. And anyhow, so I just this past week read The Younger Wife, which is Sally Hepworth's new book that comes out in April, which is amazing. And then I also read The Good Sister, which is now available. It came out last year. And both of those books were phenomenal. And they were twisty and cool and like deep reads also about female relationships. So if you like Julia's books and you like that element of them, Sally tackles that in a completely different way. They were also really quick reads and great on audiobook too. So Sally Hepworth is who I would recommend today because those were such great books.
Yeah, and she is fantastic. I mean, she's
amazing.
I mean, and I think I know she's super popular, and but I hadn't heard of her before. And so I was introduced to her a couple of years ago, and I was like, how have I not heard of her?
Yeah.
And so it's just like, she's fantastic. Julie, anybody you want to highlight?
So I had to go through and take a look at what I've read that's not been for blurbing, which I can definitely talk about, but I want something where I can also recommend that people go to Warwick's and buy this book. So The Postmistress of Paris by Meg Waite-Clayton, I thought was fabulous. It turned out, it was one of the last books I read of the year, but it turned out to be one of my favorite books of the year. I think beautifully written. It's a really interesting, different take on a story that I've seen sort of tackled from some different angles. And she tells it in just a beautiful way. And her prose is wonderful. It really is. And the research that she's done is just so, it's apparent while feeling effortless, if that makes sense. And I think that's a very writerly thing to admire. But I know how hard that is. So I was really very impressed with that. And then I wanted to shout out two things that are coming up. One is The Wedding Veil by Kristin Harmel, of course, of Friends in Fiction, who we love. It's a really fun dual timeline book. I really, really enjoyed that. And then the other was Bluebird by Genevieve Graham. Both are coming out in the late winter, early spring, I think March and April. Very close to each
March
other.
29th. Yeah.
And Genevieve writes these wonderful stories about Canadian history. And I have to admit, Canadian history is not my strong suit. It is so fascinating. Everything I've read of hers, I've just absolutely loved. And this is no different. This is about a part of Canada in Prohibition, which I was talking about it over Christmas around the dinner table. And my dad said, I didn't even know Canada had Prohibition. So it's that sort of, something very new, something very fresh. And I just think she's a fabulous author.
Oh, fantastic.
Julia, I'm jealous because Genevieve emailed me to say, well, you can't blurb this book because I want you to blurb my next book. I'm like, no, I want them all. So
minute. I love it. Jealousy blurbing. That's fantastic. But you're right, Julia. Meg Waite-Clayton's book is so good. It's a thick one, but it's worth it. I mean,
it really is.
It's really good. Okay. You all are scrolling too fast for me. So I've written down some questions because it's like, I'm going a little crazy trying to follow them. So one of them was from Sharon. And do you have pictures of the dress? I know that you did the research, but do you have pictures of the dresses? And she wants to know, do you sew?
I literally started sewing today. Excellent question. No joke. If you can't see it right now, but my living room is a mess.
That's hysterical.
My living room is a mess because I got a sewing machine for Christmas. I'm super excited about it. I've been a knitter for a very long time, but I've wanted to sort of go into sewing because I love the fashion of this era and all of that. And so I've cut out on my dining room table. My partner is not here right now, which is why there's just sewing stuff spread all over the flat. So the sewing machine is set up. I'm going to do a little sewing tonight. The pattern's cut. So wish me luck because it's going to be a mess, but it will be an exciting mess. So
what is it? Are you making a dress? What are you making?
It's a circle skirt in this color. So it's going to be a mess, but it's going to be a bright mess. And I'm very excited.
I like it.
So, I'm very long time since I've done anything on a sewing machine. What was the other question?
Do you have pictures of the dresses? Yeah.
Pictures of the dresses. I don't have pictures of the dresses with me, but thank you for asking. This is one of the society magazines that I used for research. And there's actually pictures of the debutantes, specifically some of the debutantes who were in the last presentations. So you can see in that scene that I talked about, she's getting her photograph taken, and this is essentially what she would have been doing, getting her studio headshot done. And so these magazines feature, fashion, they feature travel, a lot of the sort of socialite roundup type of things that you would see in some magazines that still do them today. And so this was a great resource. And I actually ended up using one of the magazines throughout the story in order to kind of reveal different things and raise the stakes a little bit between some of the girls. So it was fun to get to weave some of that in.
Oh, very fun. And then somebody else asked, and I'm apologizing to who's asking these questions because honest to goodness, it's been a long time since I've had this great of an event that had so many comments coming. So somebody wanted to know about the dances. So were there certain specific dances, and were there ones that were popular, and what were they the same, or what's the deal with
so
them?
You have a few different things. So you have dances that were sort of hallmarks of the calendar. So something called Queen Charlotte's Ball, which was really the official kickoff of the balls. So the season would be the presentations, cocktail parties for the most part, and then you get into balls. And you had balls in London, you had balls in the countryside, you had balls in Dublin, you had balls in Scotland. You were traveling all over the place, and girls would literally get onto trains. 18-year-old girls who just left school would get onto trains with a suitcase and just hope that somebody would pick them up at the other end, because the family that invited them would have arranged for them to stay somewhere nearby in the countryside. So you had this kind of, you just go with your little case and your dress and you just show up and somebody will pick you up and give you dinner and drive you to the ball, and you go to the ball, and they would typically be all night affairs. So, they would be ending with breakfast at, dawn essentially. But yeah, it was a lot of sort of what you would consider kind of standard music today. Lots of sort of jazz standards, orchestras playing, things like that.
And do they have to learn these dances? Or is that part of like the grooming up to?
You would have sort of known how to dance or been trained to dance. There was a whole separate thing actually at a place called Madame Vacani's Dance Academy, which was learning to curtsy to the Queen was a thing. And the curtsy sounds incredibly difficult because you have to lock your knee in a certain way and not wobble. But the dancing, you would have probably known, the waltz, the foxtrot, kind of standard ballroom dances, so that you could partner with whoever asked you to dance.
So fascinating.
Yeah.
I love it. And Sharon, I think you had asked this, or somebody, Susan might have, back in the day. So, and you touched on this in the conversation about friendship and girls' friendships, but there was also like an exclusionary kind of thing that happens with either because of social standings or whatever. And this is a little bit of a personal question, but in your teenage years, in those years, did either of you have kind of that experience of being excluded in a friendship or in a kind of a group setting? So Kristin, you want to start with that one? This was a question to both of you.
Yeah, sure. Middle school was really awkward for me. And in fact, I was thinking, I remember going to cotillion, which was the dance thing. Like, it wasn't like a society coming out, but it was like you learned to do all this ballroom dancing. And it was, I don't know, it was lots of drama with boys and other girls and all of that in middle school. And I remember always feeling a little bit out of sync with everyone else, and at times excluded, because, girls can be, it's interesting, kind of how you were saying earlier, Julia, like there is that stereotype that women are either like all catty or, all like, oh, we're sisters, but but there's so much of that nuance, even when you're a teenager. And I think it was at its height for me when I was in middle school. So yes, I certainly remember being, feeling excluded and feeling left out and feeling, that's specifically at cotillion, which is weird.
Which is really kind of, it's kind of this kismet kind of thing. With it.
It is. Well, and it's funny that tracks.
There might be a couch that we're seeing in the future on
gosh.
It's funny. I never did cotillion, but people I knew did, and that tracks exactly what everybody was telling me about cotillion. I'm not entirely sure anybody I knew enjoyed it. My experience was maybe a little bit more along the lines of, I had a nice group of friends I had been friends with throughout, school, and I was never one of the popular girls or anything like that. And I don't remember that bothering me at all, but I do remember what bothered me was starting to feel a bit like I didn't relate to people in the way that I once had, and feeling a bit out of sync with my friends. And one of the ways that manifested was I went to university in a completely different place than most other people did. So when I came back after that first semester and, was on winter break and met up with everybody, I just felt like I was living in a completely different world than everybody else. They had all stayed closer to home. They had all had very similar experiences. And in some cases were actually living together or living very close to each other. So they saw each other all the time. So that wasn't necessarily them actively excluding me, but me feeling like maybe the world had shifted a bit. And it was an uncomfortable thing, but I think ultimately probably the right thing to happen, because they had their lives and they seemed to be enjoying their lives very much. And I was creating a life for myself somewhere else, which would
kind of made you stronger too, probably, in a way.
I think so.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's a hard strong, but
yeah. And I know in my bio, I've mentioned I lived a lot of different places and sort of had a lot of different experiences of starting over again and again. And I think actually that is a skill set that I ended up starting to gain because of that experience.
That makes a lot of sense.
We got a couple more, a couple of other questions, and then we got to wrap up because we're going to run into the time limit here. Real quick about the titles for the last Garden of England, and then the last is that just how it just happened?
Yeah.
When you got the last of things there.
That's the last, as my family was joking, this is my last period. No, it's just coincidence. So this book was, and I've told the story before, but this book was originally called The Last Debutante. And then Georgie Ballack came out with a book in August called The Last Debutante. And there's a rule in publishing, she who publishes first gets the title. And so I emailed my editor as soon as I found out, and I said, oh no, this has happened. We need to pivot. We need a new title. And then I emailed Georgie and I said, do you want to be on my show so we can talk about the fact that we both have debutante books? And it was great. It was a lot of fun. It was fun.
She's so great.
Well, and her book is really interesting. It's about a different time period and a different set of debutantes. But this was as many, I don't know if you've had the same experience, Kristin, but I've had no titles make it through with what I thought they were going to be on the first draft. Yeah. It always ends up being sort of workshopped as a collaboration between me, my editor, my sales team, all of that. So The Last Dance of the Debutante, I'm really happy with, because I think it evokes the book, and there is a sort of a last dance moment in the book that works really nicely. But it was not what I originally thought it was going to be.
That's funny.
And to just wrap things up, Kristin, I don't know if you can tell us what you're working on next, or give anybody a little clue. I'm thinking that probably something may be coming next year from you.
It'll be out in March of 23. And man, if you could tell me how it ends, that would be fantastic. Would anyone like to tell me what I'm working on next? No, I'm just kidding. It's due in about 3 weeks, and so I know where I'm going with it, but it's like, I don't know if this happens to you, Julia, but like, I know how it's going to end, but I don't know exactly how it's going to end. Like, I don't know what the last scene is going to be yet. Yeah. And it feels like my momentum has slowed down. Like, I was writing really fast or really quickly, and now I'm like stalling, I think, while I wait for it to almost like finally crystallize in my head. So I have a lot of anxiety. Thanks for bringing it up. No, I'm just joking. It's
we're here to help. We're here to help you.
I'm just kidding. Gosh, between that and reminding me of how Matt Patterson never asked me to dance at Cotillion, I'm not sure why I even showed up today.
You'll be coming back every week. We're just here for all the good stuff.
Just kidding.
I'm going to be that interviewer that's, if you want to cry, go talk to Julia Warwick. She's got
Julie.
it for you.
Thanks a lot. No, it's the book is called the working title, which, as Julia said, will probably change, is called The Paris Daughter. And it's about 2 mothers and 2 daughters in World War II Paris, an Allied bomb that falls where it shouldn't, which of course happened all over Europe. There were a lot of civilians killed by errant bombs. And then a storyline that picks up in New York in 1960, when a chance meeting sets back into motion these events that everyone thought the book was closed on 17 years earlier. So that's kind of and who knows how it ends. I'll let you know in 3 weeks. If I haven't had a complete emotional breakdown between, after today.
Yesterday, I'm seeing some drinking happening maybe when we get off.
Exactly. Yeah.
Where's that wine? I just got off of Warwick's.
It's 5 o'clock here, Julie. So you might not be inappropriate.
We tipped that PTSD thing, but sorry about that. And Julia, are you on a book a year kind of?
I am, yes. I've just handed in my late 2022, early 2023, I don't know when exactly it's going to fall, book, but ironically we have some commonality, although I know that the stories are going to be wildly different. So my book is partially inspired by true family events with a distant family member. So a young Catholic girl gets pregnant and is forced to marry a young Jewish boy who got her pregnant. And on the day of their wedding, he leaves her behind. They're separated by her family, and he leaves for America. And so the story picks up on the eve of war, and she has their daughter and is trying to make it as best she can, living in Liverpool. And she is forced with the really impossible decision to evacuate her daughter. And he, meanwhile, is in New York. He war is declared, and for his own various reasons, he decides to join up for the RAF. And so something happens to their daughter, and essentially these people who have been sort of living parallel lives, even though they're tied by this event, this very significant event in their lives, they are brought back together again in 1961. And they are sort of drawn together by this thing that happens. They're drawn together by their shared history, by their daughter, and also by the question of whether there could or couldn't be anything lingering as they work out what happened back in 1935. So it's done in that it's on paper, and now I'm going to have to actually edit it. So I'm going to keep my fingers crossed as I say.
Oh, it sounds so good.
Sounds really good.
Yeah.
And Kristin, yours about the errant bombs that went up. My grandfather's brother was actually killed in Guernica with when Hitler was using Guernica as a with the stray. They used to bomb and do. I mean, it's crazy. So yeah, it's they all over the place.
All
that
over.
was happening.
You're absolutely right. Oh wow, that's interesting.
It's they sound like the family still owns our family still owns the farm, and you can see the stray gunshot holes in the it's
Oh my
crazy.
goodness. Oh
Crazy.
wow.
Yeah. So the history is just like, and that's what the one thing that one of the themes of the comments was, everybody adores both of you for writing the history and giving these stories life. I mean, that is what you both do, and we appreciate it. All of us readers appreciate it so much. Outside the PTSD we did for Kristin today, we thought it was a great interview. Kristin, I hope you'll come back.
We'll see. I'm gonna send you the therapy bill.
I know, it's like you're gonna like your publicist like, oh please, not that Warwick's lady.
Someone's triggered Kristin again. Yeah.
Julia, congratulations on the book.
Much
success. Thank you for spending time with us, and all the friends in fiction and Ask Julia, Ask an Author, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today, and everybody else.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so
Julie.
much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
This has been fun. Thank you.